And then the next day, 2 of his nephews are killed. This is one person, and yet it's like a 90s horror movie where people are being picked off one by one. That's one story. There is over 200 journalists who have been killed. It felt like she was taking some comfort from us speaking to her and the fact that she was holding my hand and I was holding her hand. And at some point you've got to let go of that hand and you've got to leave and you've got to walk out the room with your camera kit. It's a very strange experience.
Even you saying it, it's hitting me like.
If you are an Arab or a Palestinian, specifically a Palestinian journalist, but by extension, an Arab journalist, you are political. Your identity is political. Your identity isn't just about your culture and your background and where you're from and your language skills. It is a political statement.
When you say existential crisis, I mean, did you basically look at your place in the industry? Did you start? Okay.
Of course, absolutely.
Okay.
Many of us looked at our places in the industry because we had been trying to get an interview with him. Everyone had been trying to get an interview. If you went into Gaza at that period of time, Yahya Sinwar is, the leader of Hamas in Gaza. You want to interview him.
Hey everyone, we're about to be joined by Hind Hassan, who's a multi-Emmy award-winning international correspondent and filmmaker. The Iraqi-British journalist has worked for major outlets like Sky News, Al Jazeera, and later Vice News, where she covered a wide range of global stories. As an independent journalist today, and as 2024 comes to a close, we're speaking to Hind about her reflections on the past year, as well as Western media coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. And we'll also be looking at some reporting highlights from her career, including her time on the ground in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond. Hind Hassan, welcome to Real Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. You're the last interview I'm doing in 2024.
Really?
Yeah.
Don't know if that's a good thing for you or... I don't know, I'll try and give it a good shot, then make it a good one.
It is a great thing. I'm really glad to have you on. We're going to be talking about a number of things in this conversation. We're going to be doing a lot of reflections. We're going to talk about some highlights from your career as well. But I want to start off with more of a personal reflection for you. You're someone who needs no introduction, but how do you look back at that young lady who studied chemistry to having a kick-ass career today? And I want to say mashallah because I don't want to give hasad as well. But
that's kind of you to say that I need no introduction. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree. Reflection in terms of where I was at university and where I am now.
Yeah.
I think if you'd have told me when I was at university that I'd have been able to do the job that I'm doing now and I've got to meet the people that I've got to meet and I've travelled to the places that I've got to travel, I wouldn't believe you. This job has absolutely been a blessing, and I know that I'm privileged to have done the work that I've done and to meet the people that I've met and to have travelled the places that I've travelled. And honestly, it's the best thing about this job is you get to sit with people and families and in the most, in places that you would never have seen or never have known. And the people that you sit with share with you their lives and their experiences and their traumas, and they trust you with their story, and you really form those relationships and bonds and memories. And I've got so many of them that I think back to and that stay at the forefront of my mind and remind me of why we do this job. Because very often in any work that you do, you can lose sight of the reason why you got into that profession or the reason why you enjoy it so much or the reason why you do it. And I think those moments and interactions that I've had always pull me back to remind me why we're in this. It's not for recognition, it's not for awards, it's not for, anything else. It is to try and elevate those voices and to give a platform to people who may not have had a platform and to address those power imbalances. And so reflecting back, I definitely would be very happy if you'd have told me this is what I'd be doing.
How important is your identity as an Iraqi British journalist?
I think it's unavoidable because we have a different, unique perspective on situations that are being covered in the news. So if you are an Iraqi and you have grown up watching what happened during the Iran-Iraq war, what happened during the Gulf War, what happened in 2003, you were most likely listening to narratives that were different to what was being presented in the UK. You were probably reading about the news and what was happening there in different contexts to what was being presented in the UK. You would likely have had family who were telling you stories, and you were hearing things that nobody else was likely to be hearing. And so therefore that forms the way that you view the conflict and the way that you view what is important. So because of my close proximity to Iraq and, having family there and seeing the human impact and the devastation that conflict can cause, that became the center of how important it was to report and how to report. And of course, there are many journalists in the UK who would do that as well. But when you have information and knowledge and language understanding that comes from, different angles, then you see things in a different light. And so therefore, yes, my identity was important, not because I'm someone who sits and goes, I'm British-Iraqi and that's important, but because there is no way of getting away from it if you are reporting and you have that unique understanding.
The reason why I asked you the question about identity, again, it goes back to reflecting. How have you been looking back at Israel's war on Gaza? Obviously, it's not finished, and what's widely called a genocide right now. But as a journalist of Arab Iraqi heritage, how have you been looking back at events since October 7th?
I would say that since October 7th, 2023, and the period in between has probably been the most difficult time for myself as a journalist, and I know for many other journalists as well. It's definitely provided a bit of an existential crisis because for many different reasons.
When you say existential crisis, did you basically look at your place in the industry? Did you start? Okay.
Of course,
you started
absolutely.
Assessing it. Okay.
Many of us looked at our places in the industry.
Yeah.
I think that, for example, the killing of journalists in Gaza, Palestinian journalists in Gaza, who continue to be killed until today, has caused a lot of pain and frustration amongst, I think, not just people from my background, but many minority journalists and I think from every single background, the fact that they continue to be killed, and, it's our feeling that more should be done to prevent them being killed, just from an industry perspective. We're not even talking about the conflict here. We're talking about other journalists who are our colleagues within our industry. These journalists continue to be targeted today, and they continue to be killed. And I don't know if it was happening in different places, whether the response would have been exactly the same. And I think that has definitely caused a lot of sadness, frustration, and anger. And then also the coverage of what's happening in Gaza. Normally, when there is a war or a conflict or something that's happening in a certain country, you turn to that particular region, the journalists there, for their expertise, for their advice, for their guidance. But then when it comes to journalists from a Middle Eastern or Arab background, where they may be turned to for their language skills or the contact skills, but not necessarily their expertise and their understanding of the region. And I'm talking, obviously, not every single news organization, but this has definitely been the experience of a lot of people. They feel side-eyed.
Yeah.
They feel that, okay, be careful how much you say because you don't want to be cast as biased. And I think, for example, the Pulitzer Prize for journalism, over the past number of years, the Pulitzer has been given to journalists from certain backgrounds where there has been conflict and where they've been killed or they've worked under very difficult conditions. So Afghanistan, they received an award for the journalists of Afghanistan. Ukraine recently, they received a Pulitzer Prize for the journalists of Ukraine. But when it came to Palestinians in Gaza, the wording was very specific. It said, for journalists working on Gaza. So it wasn't about the Palestinian journalists.
What did that mean to you? How did you take that in?
What it meant was, well, by definition, if you are an Arab or a Palestinian, specifically a Palestinian journalist, but by extension, an Arab journalist, you are political. Your identity is political. Your identity isn't just about your culture and your background and where you're from and your language skills. It is a political statement. And to have that response so glaringly that's not consistent from one country to another, it's there in front of your face. You're seeing it. It's not a conspiracy or a hypothesis that's being presented. It's there in front of you. Palestinian journalists are political just by being called Palestinian journalists, and by extension, Middle Easterners or people from Arab backgrounds. And I think that's very difficult. I mean, what has happened too, I have to say this because I remember when, just after October 7th, when the bombardment of Gaza started and journalists were killed. And by the way, journalists in Gaza have been killed for many, many years. Every time there is a bombardment, offices are attacked, journalists are killed, and their families are also killed. This is something that has happened before. It's not the first time. But since October the 7th, 2023, many of us, many journalists from all different backgrounds, spoke out and said journalists are being targeted. CPJ have been speaking about it. Reporters Without Borders have done investigations. Many places, journalistic institutes have spoken out about it. And
it's the deadliest on record as well for journalists and media workers.
In a period of time, no other journalist in history has been killed so many times in such a short period of time. Yes. And it's still happening. And when we spoke out right at the beginning that something needs to be done. They need to be protected. These journalists are being killed.
Yeah.
And some of the stories that have happened and some of the killings that have happened, you can't, if you think back, was that real? Just the story of Wa'il Dahdouh. Mm-hmm. I still think about it today. Wa'il was reporting on air, and then he reports on air about an airstrike at the camp where his family is staying. Then he finds out that his wife and 2 children and 8 members of his extended family have been killed. The cameras are on him as he cradles the dead bodies of his own children. And then he returns back to TV. He returns back on air. He continues reporting despite his wife and 2 kids being killed. He's then in another attack, a drone attack, which injures him and also his friend, Samir Abu Daqqa. He's injured in the leg. His friend is injured in the leg, so can't escape. Wa'il leaves, raises the alarm. The Al Jazeera is communicating with the Israeli military in order to try and allow them to let ambulance and paramedics in so that they can get to Samir. But every time paramedics try, they're shot at. In the end, he's left to bleed out for over 5 hours, and he dies, and he's killed. And then maybe a month after, in January 2024, you have his son, Hamza, is then killed in a drone attack. And then the next day, 2 of his nephews are killed. This is one person, and yet it's like a 90s horror movie where one person where people are being picked off one by one. That's one story. There is over 200 journalists who have been killed. There's a journalist who break down live on air because they have to report on another one of their colleagues who is being killed. There's Yumna Asayed, who talks about how she had to have her daughters look down on the floor so that she doesn't look to the sides and see the dead bodies that are, either side of them. There are stories after stories after stories, and they are horrific, and it's still happening. And every time, the fact that you can have these extreme situations, these extreme scenarios, and yet 5 journalists in a van on Boxing Day will still be killed and attacked and then excused and being called terrorists.
With no evidence.
Not only with no evidence, but also under international law, it is illegal to target civilians, whether they be health workers, civilians, journalists, that are not directly partaking in military activities. So if you have a group that is affiliated with a fighting group, say perhaps they receive funding, and I'm not saying that's what these journalists were, I'm talking hypothetical, then you still cannot target them unless you have proof that they were directly partaking in military activity. This is one of the things that we've done in the investigation that we're doing for Middle East Eye, the documentary that we have that's coming out on the Lebanese health workers, because Israel would go online using its social media and it would say that they have been targeting Hezbollah facilities or Hezbollah offices and buildings. And they also released a video about how there were health workers who were affiliated with Hezbollah that were carrying weapons inside their ambulances. But there's no proof that any weapons were being carried in any ambulances. It would have been exposed pretty quickly. There's a hell of a lot of media in Lebanon. They would have seen it after the attacks. And also, what's really important is even if the health organization like Hayat Sahiyya in Lebanon is affiliated to Hezbollah, they are still protected under international law because the work that they're doing is to save civilians, is to rescue civilians, help them, and to save them. So unless you have proof that they are carrying weapons and shooting and partaking in military activity, it doesn't mean that it's okay to target them. And I mean, this is in like an extreme scenario that we're talking about. The reality is that the journalists who are in Gaza are journalists. They are going out, they are reporting, and they are being killed. And then they are later on, there is information that is being put out into the social sphere that is aligning them or alleging that they are terrorists. And it undermines their right to exist and their right to stay alive and not to be killed extrajudicially.
Yeah, and despite everything that you just listed, I mean, and this has been one of the problems with Western media coverage, a lot of the outlets, is when the journalism is presented that's done by these Palestinian journalists, it's always done, or it's always presented with a caveat. There's always a caveat. It's never like taken at face value for what it is,
I agree with that. An example is, for example, when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed.
Yes.
When Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, there were 5 other journalists who were with her. And immediately after her death, the 5 other journalists, who are eyewitnesses and journalists, came out and said she was targeted by the Israeli military. She was killed by the Israeli military. We saw the tank over here. This is the series of events that took place. Mm-hmm. And yet, that wasn't enough in terms of sources to be able to say at the beginning that Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by the Israeli military. I don't know if you remember, but at the time when Shireen Abu Akleh was first killed, there were all these reports online, the same thing that always happens. Oh, it wasn't armed groups. Yeah, it was armed groups that were around. Armed groups accidentally killed her.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Israeli military. It was, misinformation, disinformation that was just put out into the social sphere, and it basically meant that at the beginning, during the initial reporting, it wasn't said explicitly Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by the Israeli military. And instead, you had this situation where it was a journalist died. Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, but it doesn't say who killed her.
Right, the language.
Right. But there were 5 journalists with her, and they all came out and they gave their series of events that took place, which suggested that it was the Israeli military that killed her. But that wasn't enough. Their sources, 5 journalists, I couldn't think of anywhere else in the world. If you had 5 journalists from that place who all gave information, normally, as a journalist, you need to corroborate the story with, 2 sources, 3 sources. This is many people who work for, news organizations. So yeah, it doesn't have, but why is that? Why is it that those Palestinian journalists were not enough? Why are they not enough?
Does it go back to the whole idea of them being political, like you said earlier?
Absolutely. It's because as a Palestinian, you can't just be a journalist. The title, the name that you are a Palestinian means that you are viewed as a political entity.
And we've seen how crucial these Palestinian journalists have been in covering the war. You're someone who deals with a lot of Palestinian journalists, inside Gaza and outside Gaza. Tell me about your experience firsthand with dealing with journalists on the ground.
With Palestinian journalists?
Yes.
We wouldn't have been able to do any of the work that we have done without the Palestinians who were working on it. And actually, all of our reports that we have created and produced from Palestine have been with the support and work and collaboration of Palestinian journalists, both living in Jerusalem and those who live abroad, American Palestinians who work with us. We also work with Israelis. We work with lawyers. We work with so many different people to bring these documentaries together. It's never a 1 or 2 or 3 person job. It has people from everywhere, and the Palestinians that we work with on the ground,
specifically in Gaza as well.
So the Palestinians that we work with on the ground in both Gaza and the occupied West Bank and occupied Jerusalem are incredibly important because they know everyone. They're in the communities. They've built these relationships up for years. Also, a lot of Palestinians are very wary of the way that some media will cover, and they may also feel exhausted that they've told their stories 1,000 times and they don't feel like anything's changing. So our collaboration with Palestinian journalists allows us to get into the room with people. I mean, we still have to speak to them and, ask them to trust us to tell their stories. Sure. But, if there is a Palestinian, I remember there was someone we interviewed just in 2023 was a young Palestinian man whose father had been killed in a raid in the occupied West Bank, in an Israeli raid. He was just an innocent bystander, and he was shot and killed by the Israeli military. And this young man found out about it because he worked in a hospital, and his father was brought in and being operated on, and he had no idea that the surgeon who was operating on this man was operating on his father, and he was helping the doctor. He was bringing the doctor tools to help him try and save this man, but he didn't survive. And then this young man walks into the room and looks at the person who didn't make it, and it was his father. And it's such a horrific story. The reason why we were able to sit with this man on Eid day, he gave up his time for us on Eid, is because of the Palestinian journalists we work with who, will build these relationships, will speak to them, will talk to them and give them the context and tell them what it is that we're trying to do. They do the really, really, really hard work. And then, we wouldn't have been able to sit with him and talk to him about something so personal and so traumatic if we didn't have these relationships with the journalists that we work with. And that's the thing, like in Gaza, the majority of the information that we're getting out is from the Palestinian journalists. They have done an incredible job, and they continue to do so to this day, of giving us the information, and they continue to act incredibly professionally. This is what's crazy about it, that journalists in Gaza are, Palestinian journalists are political or actually They're some of the most incredibly professional journalists you will ever get to work with. I remember one of the journalists the documentaries that we filmed, that we were working with a journalist inside Gaza, and his daughter had been shot. Yeah.
Hassan Jarrah, yeah.
Yeah, Hassan Jarrah.
He was the DOP on Starving Gaza. Yeah.
He was. And his daughter had been shot and killed in front of him by Israel. He didn't tell me that.
He didn't tell you that?
He wasn't the person who told me that.
Who told you that?
Well, Al Jazeera had done a report on him previously, so...
And this happened while he was working on the documentary?
No, not while he was working. Okay. It happened before. His daughter had been killed, I think, in December 2023. I think that's when it took place. Al Jazeera had done a report on him previously, so there is a report of him online. I Googled his name, and I found out that is the details of what had happened to him. But in terms of my relationship with him as a journalist that I was working with, he didn't tell us about that. He didn't mention or talk about the trauma that he'd gone through. He turns up and he filmed. We had one of the scenes where I speak to the doctor in Kamal Adwan Hospital, and which is, I mean, currently what's happening in Kamal Adwan Hospital is, there are no words for it. But we were filming. They were filming in Kamal Adwan Hospital. We were in Washington. We had a camera crew where we were. There was a camera crew. Hassan Jarrah was on the other side, and the line would cut out continuously over and over again because reception and internet connection would fall in and out. We had to call them numerous times to get through, and it was incredibly professional. The communication was entirely journalistic. They waited, connected, filmed. They did a great job of the filming. Professionals.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say far more professional than I would have ever been reporting in the UK if something was happening. If I was seeing bodies and members of my family being killed around me, I don't know how I would be responding. They have, in fact, I think they've responded to these allegations that have been thrown around about them by becoming so incredibly just by the book, which they shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to be like that.
And yet, what do you make of this double standard when you see Western journalists coming out and saying, like, comments like, there are no independent Western journalists in Gaza? And yet, once these journalists do enter Gaza, they rely on the same people, the same journalists as fixers, as translators, as people to help them with their coverage. When they're the ones who are reporting the atrocities taking place, again, like we were saying before, it also has to come with some sort of caveat. It's something that you can't take at face value.
Yeah. I will say that there are a lot of really great Western journalists who have supported their colleagues in Gaza and who have spoken out for them, and that I do think that's really important to say, because
I'm not saying it as a blanket term.
Yeah, absolutely. But they do exist. What I think it is the organizations.
Sure.
As well. There are people as well who could do more, absolutely. But in a lot of the places, the organizations, they have to... they don't have to, but they caveat. They're the ones who have the so-called editorial standard, where things like you can't say the word Palestine, or you have to say the Hamas-led ministry, or these terminologies, and it's the wording, these types of wording, that undermines the Palestinians as well who were there, and also the journalists who were there. And I do think there does still need to be, despite, there are people who are definitely knowledgeable and have spoken out, and there are a lot of, journalists who are speaking out. But I think that more does need to be done, because, as you say, none of the coverage of any news organization in the Middle East, in Europe, in the West, would be able to be done without the local journalists who work there, without the filming that they do, without the reporting that they do, without them putting themselves at risk. And if, the entry into Gaza is ever lifted, hopefully it will be, but if it's lifted, they will go in and they will again rely on the journalists who are in there. So it must be incredibly frustrating for them when they hear that, either the term independent Western journalists. And by the way, I do believe that journalists should be allowed into Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that international journalists should be allowed in, because that is the freedom of press. That's what we should have. We should have access to countries. We should be able to report on whatever we want to report on. But it's the notion that we need to go because, that means we're the independent journalists that are going in, and the journalists in there are not independent. That's not the case. We should be allowed to go in because that is the right of journalists to be able to go into locations and to report. And we condemn regimes and other countries that don't allow journalists to report freely. But the journalists, we also need to acknowledge at the highest standard, at the highest levels, that the journalists in Gaza are incredible, have done a beyond human job in the work that they have done, and that they are enough. They have been enough. I said this right at the beginning, just after the bombardment of Gaza began, and I'll say it again, is that Gaza journalists are incredible. They are the titans of journalism, and we will look back at the work that they have done and will be horrified with what they have gone through, and we will be in awe of the work that they have done.
Hind, you've covered Israel-Palestine quite a bit. You've also covered Russia-Ukraine, right? And with that specific war, Russia-Ukraine, I mean, when it happened, we saw very clear lines of what's right and what's wrong. Yet, again, war on Gaza following October 7th, it was portrayed to be a lot more complicated. Again, the use of language, like you touched on a bit in the interview. How have you been looking at both wars, let's say, from your personal experience?
First of all, I would say that the journalists that I worked with in Ukraine have been very supportive and have expressed empathy and their frustration at the treatment of Palestinian journalists inside Gaza and the bombardment and what's been happening there. And that is most likely because of their own unique experience, and so therefore empathy that they have with their colleagues who are on the other side of the world who are suffering and struggling. But if we look at just the bigger picture, of course there are differences. The Pulitzer Prize that I mentioned earlier, the Ukrainian journalists are awarded a prize, whereas for Palestinians, it is the journalists who are reporting on Gaza, which includes everyone in the world if they wanted it to be. And I think that is a very, very clear example of the differences of how the two conflicts, not conflicts, one's a bombardment, but how they are treated by institutions or different organizations. In Ukraine there is right and wrong. In Gaza there's like shades of gray.
Right.
In Gaza, when you hear about a Palestinian journalist who's being killed, it's we must also mention that there are allegations by the Israeli military that they are connected to Islamic Jihad.
Yes.
As if that provides some
the caveat.
Yeah, actually guys, just yes, they were killed. Yes, it was extrajudicial. Yes, they were targeted, but this is what's being said. And also, by the way, we can't verify that that's true. That to me is not journalism. That to me is covering your back because, you have to or you've been told to. But actually it's very dangerous because you're putting it out into the world that there is a caveat. So it's not 100% this shouldn't happen.
And you immediately start questioning the coverage.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just cannot see a similar situation. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is a situation where Ukrainian journalists have been targeted and somebody has reported and said, but Russia claims that they were working for whatever. But but I haven't seen it. A journalist is a journalist, you know.
But the issue has been even a lot simpler than that, I think, with what people were highlighting. It's like we said briefly, the wording. We've seen a lot of headlines where it was very clear that, you know, it would say, you know, Ukrainians killed by Russian airstrike.
Yes.
Whereas when it comes to Gaza, it's, you know, Palestinians die. Or as a result of...
Not just that, but not even mentioning Israel.
No.
That's what happens
exactly.
a lot. Issam Abdullah, who was killed in the south of Lebanon by Israel, for a long time, the reporting did not mention Israel.
Yeah.
And unless you went into the text and read, which is that came from the direction of Israel. That's what it said. So there was this pirouetting around the words of saying it was Israel, but we can't really say it is because Israel hasn't said it's them yet. And so we have to say it's come from the direction of. What does that mean if it's come from the direction of? Yes, so that happened with journalists. It's happened with, you know, many situations where in Gaza or in Lebanon, there wouldn't be the reporting in the headline that Israel fired a missile killing, you know, X amount of people. Whereas in Ukraine, of course that happened. Of course it was said that. It didn't say from the direction of Russia.
Yeah.
So there's definitely been... I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that. And I think I think that's the biggest issue that people have is the lack of consistency. And it's very clear that there is a lack of consistency. And, you know, just highlighting that there's a lack of consistency, that's what everyone should be doing. But for a lot of journalists, they don't feel like they can say that. And they want to, you know, they're working in these organizations and they're afraid for their jobs, and that is a reality.
I want to talk about some of your work right now. We mentioned Starving Gaza, so let's talk about it. It's a film that you did for Al Jazeera, and it explores how Israel uses starvation as a weapon of war. Now, what did you learn from that film and that experience? What did you walk away with?
Well, I guess I learned that starving a group of people isn't just done by holding back food or not allowing food to get in. It's a lot more than that. What we heard over and over again was death by 1,000 cuts. It was many different things that leads to a situation of malnutrition in young babies or in the starvation of people. And it includes arbitrarily stopping certain aid trucks from getting in because of rules or legislations or arbitrary rules that they are implementing when they want to implement, or if a particular ingredient that is needed to make bread is prevented from getting in so that they can't make bread, or if aid workers are attacked, or if the roads are blocked, or if you target hospitals, or if you target people when they go to get bread. There are many, many different ways that you create these obstacles and issues and destruction that stops a nation from being able to sustain itself. And actually, we had a talk we had a screening of Starving Gaza at the Frontline Club. And there we had a professor who was talking about that this isn't the first time where starvation has been used as a tactic of war against Palestinians. And it's happened in Gaza previously, many, many years ago. And so it's a tactic that has been used. I think also what we learned as well was just how much the US government knew about what was happening.
Yeah.
And because, of course, preventing aid and food from getting to civilians is a war crime. And if it was proved that Israel was doing that, it would mean that the United States would have to reconsider the weapons, the billions of dollars that it gives to Israel in weapons, And so, as part of this documentary and the investigation that we did and the people that we spoke to, it was very clear based on the evidence that the US was fully aware from the advice that it had been given from senior officials and from experts that this was being done on purpose by Israel. And they were very aware of this. And yet it continued to happen, and they continued to provide funding.
Let me talk about that right now. There was, you had that exchange with Stacey Gilbert, who was a U.S. State Department official, who said that Israel's deliberately blocking aid, and then she resigned from the Biden administration. So that was one interesting exchange in the film. And then you had an exchange with Matthew Miller, who was the U.S. State Department spokesperson, or is at this time. And he denied that, Israel is blocking aid.
He referred to the same report that Stacey Gilbert said was falsified.
Right. So again, what did you walk away, or with that contradiction in mind, how'd you feel with both of these exchanges?
I mean, I was not really expecting Matthew Miller to turn around and say, oh yes, actually we knew. It's his job, that's what he does there. Our aim is to pressure and to show those inconsistencies, or to highlight, or to try and search for some form of accountability. The journalists that we were working with inside of Gaza, they were the ones who were providing the case studies, the information, gathering that information, the conversations that we were having with the aid workers. That was also becoming part of our body of evidence that we were gathering. And then when we spoke to Matthew Miller, that was our attempt to try and search for some form of accountability or acknowledgement of this information that we were gathering and the US response. But I think it was very clear that the US had a line, and it had a line that it stuck to. So what Matthew Miller said, maybe, before we went in, we could, if we were to sit down and predict what he would have said, you could probably get very close to what he actually said. It's the US line. That's what Stacey Gilbert said. She said that the US had accepted that this was the line that it was going to follow for political reasons. And that's what we highlighted. That's what we showed when we went in there and had that conversation. That despite the body of evidence, despite what their own former senior State Department officials were saying, that they were going to stick to the line. But actually, not that long after Starving Gaza came out, the State Department did write a letter to Israeli officials saying that they had to improve conditions and allow aid in within 30 days. I mean, a lot of the aid organizations said 30 days is not urgent. What are they going to do in 30 days? Changes need to be made now. And that this was just because they were under pressure because of the overwhelming evidence. But the reality is that not enough pressure was made. And by the way, these concerns were raised again right from the beginning. As soon as the bombardment of Gaza began, there were statements that were made by Israeli officials which very clearly said that we intend to create a siege, we intend to stop humanitarian aid getting in. That was said right at the beginning. From the very beginning, there were aid workers who were attacked, or civilians who were targeted, or hospitals that were attacked. This was said right from the start, and there was evidence in US cables that had suggested that people were voicing concerns. We did an investigation, I can't remember, it was very, very early on, where we had got hold of US cables which highlighted that there were deep concerns from within the US administration that the attacks that were taking place, or the infrastructure that was being damaged, or the aid that was being prevented from getting in, could be tantamount to war crimes, and therefore, the US could be complicit. This was being highlighted and raised right from the very beginning. So by the time we made Starving Gaza, there was a whole body of evidence that had been collected that was very clear for anyone to see. And so that exchange was about presenting that and just, seeing what the US government had to say for it.
And you've been to Gaza, right, in 2021. I think it was after the 11-day bombardment by Israel. What was that experience like?
it was, yeah, it was a very hectic time because Gaza was, the international journalists were not allowed in.
Yeah.
Gaza was being bombarded. We were seeing all of the footage like what we're seeing today, but on a shorter period of time. And then I remember we went to the Erez crossing, which is how you get into Gaza, and
From Israel,
and there were lots of journalists there because we'd all heard that they were potentially going to open the crossing. And so there was lots and lots of journalists from many different networks all waiting at the Erez crossing. And then as soon as they opened the gates, we just kind of rushed through.
Just ran through.
We ran through, tried to get in as quickly as possible. We met up with the journalists that we were going to work with. And the journalists that we were working with had just experienced 11 days of cowering in homes and being afraid. And then suddenly there were these people who would come in, international journalists, and it was like this energy, but
yeah,
it's
what was
indescribable.
That? Yeah.
It really is. It's difficult to describe because they had this like desire, the journalists that we worked with, this desire to, immediately start working and reporting and to do these reports. But also I don't think they had processed anything that they had gone through. I mean, I don't know if you can process your experience in Gaza because of how often there are bombardments, and so this is like something that regularly happens.
And how do you process it on an emotional and personal level? Because you had, during that experience, if I'm not mistaken, you had spoken to someone who had lost like 22 members of his family.
Yeah.
So again,
Shukri.
Shukri was his name. I'm talking about you on your personal front. How do you balance that emotionally and professionally?
I guess I always come back to the fact that I know how lucky I am and how privileged I am, and so that kind of is the weight that I focus on, which is that whenever I went to Gaza, that's the difference, is that I went to Gaza, I reported, and then I left, but the journalist that I worked with is actually still there now. He's still in Gaza. He didn't leave, and he never got to leave. He didn't leave after the 11-day bombardment. He didn't leave after what's happened now. I mean, some journalists have managed to leave Gaza, but the one that we worked with hasn't. Still there, and I get to leave. I get to go to the comfort of my home, and so it's always a little bit awkward being asked about how do you cope, because it's like, well, I'm kind of in a very privileged position. I get to sit in this like nice warm studio and talk about and reflect on Gaza, but I'm not actually there being rained on with bombs, and so what have I got to complain about?
Is it some sort of guilt when you think back to the journalists who were there?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's guilt to the people that we speak to and the interviews that we do. It's horrible because for example, when we went to the earthquake that was in Turkey and Syria, 2023. I'm saying 2023 because this is the end of 2024.
By the time this goes out, it'll be 25.
All the years are rolling into one.
Yeah. There was a lady on the bed that you spoke to in Syria who had lost family members.
Yeah. She didn't know her daughter had been killed in the earthquake. And I was speaking to her, and she held onto my hand when we were doing the interview. And, we did that interview, and it felt like she was taking some comfort from us speaking to her and the fact that she was holding my hand and I was holding her hand. And, at some point you've got to let go of that hand and you've got to leave and you've got to walk out the room with your camera kit. It's a very strange experience.
Even you saying it, it's hitting me like it's...
Yeah, it's horrible because my worst nightmare is ever being that journalist who goes in and does an interview with somebody and then goes, it's a wrap. These people are sharing with you trauma and you're there, you're listening to them, and you're getting them to share with you these really horrific moments. And the most important thing for me is that when I leave, I've not caused more damage, or that there is, that they feel content in our exchange. That's the most important thing. That when the cameras stop, we continue that conversation. We continue talking to them. We'll have those conversations with them, and we'll speak to the doctors. And I think that's the thing that is the most difficult, is having these interactions with people who are in the most difficult period of their lives, and then knowing that you get to leave. And I don't, that woman, we did pass on her details to some of the emergency organizations that were about to enter Syria and that were going into Syria. But I don't know how that woman's life is right now, because it's difficult to communicate with her. I think that's what a lot of journalists, like, the guilt that we feel. And so that's not to say that people shouldn't focus on their mental health and, people's welfare is definitely very important in order that you do the job. I guess it's just, sometimes it's quite difficult to do that, knowing that I'm sat here, whereas there are journalists and people that we've spoken to who are still in the situation that they're in. But that being said, like, I think I do what everybody else does, which is, exercise or run or, try and find some form of escapism.
In that Gaza experience, and this is something that you've gotten a lot of media attention for, because you actually interviewed Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas, and he was killed this year in 2024. You said you saw him walking down the street in Jabalia. Again, what was that experience like? So you just saw him walking down the street with his entourage or, his people, and then you approached him?
Yeah, literally, we were just walking down the street. He'd come out of a mosque, and he had an entourage around him, and we saw that there was some movement, or there was definitely somebody important who was across the road. We didn't know who it was, and then one of our members of the team is like, it's Yahya Sinwar. And so I was with Lema Al-Aryan, who's the producer that I work with quite a lot, and she had we were both there, and we were like, we've got to go. And the Palestinian team that we were with were also saying, go speak to him. So we just.
What was going on through your head as you were approaching him? Like, you're walking towards him right now.
Let's just go speak to him.
That's
get
it.
there. Yeah, immediately. Like, because we had been trying to get an interview with him. Everyone had been trying to get an interview. If you went into Gaza at that period of time, Yahya Sinwar is the leader of Hamas in Gaza. You want to interview him. But we were told over and over again, he's in hiding. You're not gonna be able to interview him.
Right.
Like, it's just not gonna happen. But you get told this a lot when you're a journalist. You still try and get that interview. You still try and get the access. You'll still have those meetings, and so we had been talking about wanting an interview with Yahya Sinwar, and Lema had been trying to set up an interview for some time. And so had already, put some groundwork in. So when we saw him, we were like, right, we no longer have to send in the emails or turn up for meetings to try and get this interview. We'll just go and ask him to his face. And it was, we've done it before. Whenever you see someone who is important to the report that you're doing, you'll go and try and doorstep them. That's what we call it, doorstepping.
Sure.
You run up and you stick a camera in their face. We knew that in this
not
scenario, sticking a camera in his face was not the best idea. But we wouldn't have been able to get close to him. There's no way. The fact that we didn't have a camera and we managed to approach him.
Was it just like, hi, I'm Hind Hassan for Vice News.
Yes,
I'd like to interview
absolutely
you.
that.
Okay.
We introduced ourselves, and we're from Vice, and we really would love to do an interview with you. We think it's very important that we hear from you. And he stood and he listened, and he was very calm, and he I can't remember the specifics of what he said, but it was around okay, talk to my team and we'll have a look into whether it's possible. And I said to him, well, I hope you're a man of your word, and I hope that you actually follow through, and you're not just saying this to get, I hope that you follow through and you do genuinely consider this, and played that whole honor that you often, you have to play a game sometimes.
Him at his word,
so, yeah. So I said, if you're a man of your word, I hope that you would actually consider it. And I think we had one more meeting with this team since then. I can't remember exactly, but we received a phone call, afterwards, and we were just told to be
Meet
at a
us
certain
at this
place at a
place.
certain time.
Right.
And we turned up, and we were told originally that you could have a very short period of time with like just a handful of questions, and we ended up having longer, and we asked him more questions, and he didn't at any point say, "That's it, I've got to go." And one of the questions was, you know, we asked him about allegations of war crimes,
Yes.
you know, and he didn't shy away from it. He answered the
And it's
questions.
in the interview. It's in what's
It's in the interview. You can see it, yeah. And then he got up and left.
One of the most cited quotes that he gave you in that interview was him saying that Palestinians aren't going to be well-behaved victims. What'd you make of that comment? What'd you make of what he was telling you in that interview?
He's always been quite a powerful orator, you know, and he was saying that Palestinians are under occupation, and so therefore, if you are under occupation, you can't be expected to be a perfect victim, you know, like, and he also referred to Black Lives Matter, and I guess he was trying to make that link with liberation struggles, and that you can't expect them to be perfect. But at the time when we made that, when we did that interview and it went out, it didn't really have much of an impact. Those statements did not have an impact at the time that it went out. At the time it went out in 2021, we released it a few days after we did the interview.
Right.
There wasn't really much of a response. I mean, people watched the interview, but nobody really, you know, perhaps a few people picked up on that quote, but it wasn't really something that became
because after October 7th, it went viral, basically.
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
That interview kind of just sat online. And, you know, I think even compared to some of the reports that we did at Vice, got millions of views.
Yeah.
There'd be millions of views. The interview with Yahya Sinwar, I think it has, you know, maybe like 100,000 or 150. It was a sit-alone. We published a standalone interview
100K
by itself.
for Hind Hassan is not that big.
For Yahya Sinwar, for his interview.
Sure.
You know, it was an interview with a rare interview on camera, and you know, it's still people watched the interview, and they you know, and people responded to it. But it was after the bombardment of Gaza began. Suddenly, every day I was waking up, and Lemma was waking up, and we were being tagged in posts, and we were being tagged in these screenshots, and every day it was a different post, and it was getting millions and millions of views and retweets. And yeah, it was interesting how you know, a statement that was made in 2021 suddenly became incredibly prominent after October the 7th.
Also, the parallels that he was drawing to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. Do you think he was basically trying to speak directly to a Western audience, or trying to relate to a Western audience?
Of course, absolutely. He was trying to allow people to see the similarities in what he believed and what they believed, and you know, he was saying that in Gaza it's a movement of emancipation and liberation, and you know, in order for you to understand, I guess that's what a lot of politicians do, you know, present ideas through a framework or vision that you can understand. You know, we do it in film, we do it in documentaries. He absolutely knew what he was saying, and he knew that we were an American network. I mean, he knew who we were. He knew what Vice News was, and he knew what the audience was, and the fact that I was asking questions in English and that they were being translated into Arabic, so he knew who he was talking to.
You're someone also who's done a lot of work in the occupied West Bank, and like you said, East Jerusalem as well. And you've spoken to a lot of Israeli settlers. I wanted to ask you, and I think one of the most famous ones that you spoke to is Yaakov, who was the the settler from Long Island who was in the el-Kurd family home. And then there was another documentary that you did with AJ, and there was Gideon, I think it was his name. But again, when you speak to Israeli settlers, what is the common denominator that you find from your conversations?
I guess what we already know, which is that settlers believe that they have the right to the land based on history and their religion, and that supersedes anything else before it. Jacob, Yaqub, that was also, a bit like the Yahya Sinwar, just, accidentally managed to get that interview because he had gone viral. But
that was big at the time.
It was. He was huge because if you remember, Muna el-Kurd, who...
The viral clip.
Yeah, so just for context, he lived in part of the house that was owned by the el-Kurd family, and they built an extension onto the house. The Israeli authorities had seized it from them and said, you're not allowed to have this part of your house, and they allowed settlers to move into it, and the latest person that was living in there was called Yaqub, and so he literally lived in their house.
Yeah.
And when we had gone to Sheikh Jarrah to do this report, by the way, there were no other journalists there. It was just after COVID. It was 2021, of course.
And that was huge. It was called the Battle for Jerusalem.
The Battle for Jerusalem.
Yeah, it was huge.
So the story behind that was that in 2021 there was a lockdown, and Israel was not allowing people to go into Israel to Tel Aviv, and then unless they quarantined. You had to quarantine for 2 weeks, but then there was this loophole that we found, which said that if you had antibodies, if you did a blood test and you could test for antibodies and you had COVID antibodies, then you didn't have to lock down. So we all went, and this was before Sheikh Jarrah was a big story, before it was the biggest story in the world. Nobody even cared about what was happening there. But Lemma had gone on to, what is those, there was this old app where you would go on and people would talk and have rooms where you
Clubhouse.
Yes. That was it.
Old app. Hind, get out of here.
I don't know what
this old app. It's a couple years old.
I know. Yeah, but it came and went, right? It was it was the thing to do for about 5 minutes in time, and then everybody forgot about it. I can't even remember the name. But anyway, so there was a Sheikh Jarrah clubhouse that people were talking about, that there was a court date, an important court date coming up for some of the houses in Sheikh Jarrah. I think Lemma and another colleague had been listening to it, or a colleague of ours in Lebanon was listening to it, and everyone agreed that this was a potentially important story that we would like to go and cover. We pitched it to our bosses. Our bosses said, but can you get in? You've got to quarantine for 2 weeks. We found this loophole that if you had antibodies, if you had a blood test and you had antibodies, then you wouldn't have to quarantine. So the entire team went out and got themselves vaccinated. We all just turned up at random places that were offering vaccinations if you could queue. At the time, people didn't have vaccinations yet. We hadn't got round to the different age groups that were doing it. We just turned up, got vaccinated, and after a week, I think it shows up, or after a certain period of time it shows up, we landed, went to Jerusalem. Some people came round, did a blood test. Within 24 hours, they had found that, we had the antibodies, so we didn't need to quarantine. And then immediately we hear that it's kicking off outside Al-Aqsa. So we go straight, that evening we're free from quarantine, we go to Al-Aqsa.
There was a raid, I believe, at the time.
It was insane. We turned up, there were, Israeli police everywhere, riot police, they were on horses, they were firing stun grenades, there were skunk, these...
End of Ramadan, I think.
Yeah. There were skunk grenades, I forgot what the exact term of it, but it's this really disgusting spray that smells and it just stays on you for ages, and there were young people being arrested. So already there had been some escalation, but when we turned up we were like, wow, this is really crazy. And every day it was getting worse and worse. The violence was getting worse. That was being carried out by the riot police. And then in Sheikh Jarrah, there were parallel protests as well that were taking place because of people who were being threatened with being forced out of their homes, Palestinians being forced out their homes. And so there were also riot police and horses and everything taking place at the protests in Sheikh Jarrah. And there was a video that went viral, which was Muna el-Kurd, who was, their family was one of the families that were being forced out of their homes. And she's arguing with Yaqub, and she's saying, but this is my home, and you stole my land. He's like, if I didn't steal it, somebody else would.
Yes.
And this was, everyone had seen it. It was everywhere. And we had this discussion. We were like, we should interview this guy. Like, why has nobody interviewed him? And apparently...
The only interview as well. He hasn't done an interview since, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I don't think he was going to do an interview after that. But we knocked on that door, which I think lots of people had done, and there was no answer. And we'd done that repeatedly. There is no answer because we know he lives there. And I think other people had done the same thing. And then Eamon, our the local cinematographer and journalist that we work with, he was at one of the protests in Sheikh Jarrah, and he just sees him there. So he runs up to him and he speaks to him, and he's like, hey, my colleagues would like to interview you. He gets us on the phone while he's talking to him, and he arranges I don't know why. He says, yeah, sure, come round. He's like speaking to him, and he's like, can we come and interview you? It's an American network. It's an American channel. And so he's like, yeah, come round at this time on this day. So we turned up. And I say to him, you're a difficult man to get hold of. And he says something like, I guess after the video, we needed to do some sort of PR control, I don't know, damage or something like that.
He was basically saying that he needed to clarify some things.
Yeah.
In a way or
I think he thought that this was going to be him, doing some damage control over the previous video. And he just ended up saying, whether it was a monkey, whether it was a giraffe.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, it was just, this is the thing is with journalism, sometimes you've got to be at the right place at the right time. And I think with the whole with Battle for Jerusalem, we were at the right place at the right time. And also, our colleague took that opportunity when he saw Yaqub and said, we'd like to speak to you. That's,
But with these settlers that you speak to, I mean, once you bring up the issue of Palestinians, how do they react to you?
Well, some people don't acknowledge, some of them don't acknowledge Palestinian, the word Palestinian.
Right.
Lots of the settlers that we speak to would say the same. Some of them, I remember the first time I ever spoke to Ben Gvir was in 2021 outside Sheikh Jarrah, and Ben Gvir said, there is no Palestinian, let them go live in, actually what he said was, let them go live in Iran or Iraq or Gaza, and then he said, actually no, Gaza's ours, let them live somewhere else. So he said that back in 2021, and that was before he became in government. And yeah, so a lot of them would say, look, they'll say either Palestinians don't exist, or this is our land, we have the right to live here, or do you know what, if they want to stay, that's fine, but they have to live under our rules and they have to live under, our control. That's the belief is that the land does not belong to Palestinians and that it belongs to them. And you have to understand that settlements are illegal under international law. Settlements on occupied land is illegal under international law. Israel doesn't consider all of the settlements illegal. It authorizes a lot of the settlements that exist there. So it allows settlers to live on occupied land. But there are some settlements called outposts. And those outposts are settlements that are not legal under even Israeli law. Even the occupying force does not find these outposts legal, but they allow them to exist very often, or they will make them legal. They'll go through the courts and they'll legalize these outposts. But there are a few, where they're illegal and they get taken down by Israeli forces. They'll take them down because they'll say, well, these outposts, you've not had authorization for them, we're bringing them down. So there are settlers who go beyond the jurisdiction of the occupying force and build outposts and build houses on land beyond what Israel allows them to do. I mean, the reality is, even when they're building these outposts, the settlers are supported and protected and by the Israeli forces. So even though it's technically not illegal under Israeli law, they are being supported and allowed to do this, by the Israeli military forces, which protects them always over Palestinians. But the point is that the settlers believe that all the land belongs to them, and that they're not going to just, some of them, not just going to stop based on, you know, the settlements that they've built or they're expanding, but they will try and take whatever land that they can get. And, you know, that is their aim, is to control the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And we're already seeing that there is a significant settler movement that wants to create significant settlements inside Gaza.
And we've also seen the biggest land grab in 30 years, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are entering the final section of this interview, I promise.
Yeah, you must be bored of me talking.
No, not at all. Listen, I'm trying to keep you for as long as I can. Even Yassine's enjoying it. Look at him. He's having a great time.
It's because he gets to hear it this time.
Yeah, exactly. It's in his ear now. No, we got to talk about your documentary with Middle East Eye now.
Yeah.
So you've been to Lebanon, right? You're currently working on a documentary that you filmed there. So tell me a little bit about that. You were there following Israel's bombardment and also invasion of Lebanon, which happened recently.
Yeah, we were there for just under 2 weeks, and the documentary is focused on the attacks and the killing and the targeting of emergency workers, paramedics and first responders inside Lebanon, because a significant number were killed during the all-out war, and there is significant evidence to suggest that they were on a lot of occasions targeted. And I think there's a statistic, a really important statistic, which was during attacks, I think 47%, during an attack against an emergency worker, 47% were killed, which is a very, very high number. And that adds to the evidence, the body of evidence, which suggests that they were being targeted. And so our documentary, in our documentary, we travel to the south of Lebanon, we travel to Baalbek, we report from inside Beirut and inside Lahia, which is a southern suburb, and we speak to victims, people who were at the strikes, those who lost people, and to emergency workers, and we're with them as they respond to attacks that take place. And we basically gather evidence and look into how they were killed and what the pretext, what the Israeli military response was when these attacks took place or beforehand. And what's really interesting is that we also speak to the health minister and Ghassan Abu Sitta, who is a British-Palestinian surgeon who was also inside Gaza after October 7th, working in the hospitals there. And they both draw significant parallels with what's happening in Gaza, because of course Lebanon and Palestine.
Tell me about that.
They're very
different contexts. Sure.
Different contexts, different people, different land, but it's the same military that is, that was fighting the war with Lebanon, that is bombarding Gaza. And so we were interested in those parallels that had taken place with what had happened inside Gaza and with what was happening inside Lebanon. And because, of course, I'd already done the documentary in terms of how aid was being prevented and food was being prevented from being accessed inside Gaza, and the different ways that had happened, and then seeing what was happening inside Lebanon. What was really interesting, actually, was we went to Nabatea in the south, and we embed with a paramedic there, and there on one of the strikes we turn up to a location where there was an attack, and there were many ambulances, and we were with the Civil Defence, which is a national Lebanese organisation, first responder organisation. But when we arrived at the attack site, there was also Hayat Sahiyya, which is an emergency group and paramedic group that is affiliated with Hezbollah, and they have been targeted significantly. Lots of people have been killed. And there are videos that the Israeli military spokesperson has put online, which depicts these emergency workers as terrorists, as people who carry guns. And so we knew that the people that we were surrounded by were potential targets, or they had been attacked previously. And when we got there, the sound of drones, I mean, the drones you could hear at all times. Inside Beirut, outside of Beirut, in the south, there was a sound of drones above you the entire time. You couldn't get away from it. And sometimes it was louder than others. And when we arrived at that attack site, the drone sound was deafening. It was so loud. And there were all these ambulances around. And the entire team, I think, was very afraid, because you become acutely aware that these are the scenarios that you hear about where there is an attack, where, either health workers have been killed or there's been an attack. And there's something called double tap, which is a military term where there will be an attack, and then emergency workers will turn up, and then there'll be another attack. And so we were aware that had happened previously, or that there'd been reports that had been happening. And so it was a different type of fear being on the ground then. I've been in conflict situations, and I've embedded with armies, and usually you've got either the front line ahead of you, or you're you are afraid of an attack or a bomb going off, but it's usually close by, or perhaps it's not specifically, you're in a hotel where it's being made aware that there are journalists staying at this hotel. So there's a relative amount of feeling of safety. It's still, not great. Whereas when we were at this attack site with the drone above, and there were all these ambulances around us, the overwhelming feeling was we could get hit any time, and that we had to get out of there pretty quickly. And that is quite a unique feeling, and I felt like that was maybe the closest we could get to knowing what it was like as a journalist or an emergency worker inside Gaza, where you have drones above you hovering all the time, and wherever you go, there is a possibility that you could be attacked. Obviously, it's not on the same scale, and it's nowhere near, but in terms of understanding that feeling, or understanding what they were going through, that was probably the closest that you could get to it. It's a very unique feeling, I'd say.
And what do you hope to convey through this documentary?
Well, I think we'll allow the viewers to, make up their own minds about what they get from it. But what we're trying to do is to present the experiences of people who have worked on the front lines, gather their evidence, and put together a body of evidence to show what their overwhelming experience was. Because I think following the rules and engagements of war is something that most nations would say that they want to abide by, protecting human rights, protecting the rights of the individuals. And I think sometimes, because of propaganda, because of how war works, there is an attempt to water that down, to provide a pretext or justification for something that happens outside of legal jurisdiction. And I think it's important that when we have the opportunity to be able to report and gather information and provide evidence, that we do that. And so in this scenario, our aim was to investigate the experiences and the experiences of emergency workers. And from our evidence and from what we gathered, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the emergency workers were directly targeted in some cases, and direct targeting of emergency workers who are not partaking in immediate military activity is a war crime. And there were numerous situations where we found that there was no evidence of anyone but civilians or emergency workers at those sites. and they were very specifically hit. So there was one building that was in Beirut, it was on the second floor, and it was a health centre run by Hayat Sahiyya, and it was the second floor that was hit. So of all the floors, that's the floor that was hit.
Clear target.
Yeah, there's, you can deduce that was very specifically targeted. And, we walked into that building and you could see everything around you. There was papers and, some medical equipment still on the floor. It was still there and evidence, around you. And it's in Beirut. It wasn't in Dahiya, which is the southern suburb that is a Hezbollah stronghold. It was in Beirut itself. And there were, I think, 7 people who were killed on that floor, 2 of them paramedics. So, I mean...
No, I'm looking forward to it, genuinely.
Yeah.
No, thank you for telling me about it.
No problem.
Hind, as I bring this to a close, what's next for independent journalist Hind Hassan in 2025?
I guess the aim is to... Actually, we've got some exciting things in the pipeline.
Yeah? Come on, let's put them all on the table.
I can't speak about one of the exciting things that we're doing because, I'm not allowed to, basically. But there will be, the crux of it is that there will be more investigations. There will continue to be a focus on justice, international law, and conflict. And we will always continue to provide, a platform for people to be able to tell their stories and to readdress imbalances of power. I think that's the small thing that we can try and continue doing.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that too.
Thank you so much.
On that note, Hind Hassan, thank you for going overtime. Thank you for staying. I appreciate it. It's been a real pleasure having you on. And I look forward to our next chat.
Good luck for next year.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.